In the annals of criminal history, few names evoke the same chilling recognition as Daniel Camargo Barbosa, a Colombian serial killer whose reign of terror spanned decades and crossed international borders. Known as the Beast of the Andes, Camargo's story represents one of the most disturbing chapters in South American criminal history, with authorities attributing over 150 murders to his name, though the true number may never be known. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born on January 22, 1930, in the small town of Abrego, Norte de Santander, Colombia, during a period of significant social and political upheaval in the country. His early life was marked by poverty, violence, and psychological trauma that would later be analyzed by criminologists as contributing factors to his eventual transformation into one of history's most prolific serial killers. Growing up in a deeply troubled household, Camargo experienced severe physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his stepfather, while his mother remained largely absent and neglectful. The family's economic circumstances were dire, forcing young Daniel to witness and experience hunger, violence, and instability from an early age. These formative experiences occurred against the backdrop of Colombia's La Violencia period, a brutal civil conflict that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and normalized extreme violence throughout Colombian society. As a child, Camargo displayed several warning signs that modern criminal psychologists would recognize as precursors to violent behavior. He was known to torture small animals, set fires, and engage in petty theft. His academic performance was poor, and he struggled to form meaningful relationships with peers or authority figures. Teachers and neighbors later recalled him as a withdrawn, angry child who seemed to harbor deep resentments against the world around him. The psychological profile that would later emerge painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose capacity for empathy had been systematically destroyed through years of abuse and neglect. Criminal psychologists who studied his case identified classic markers of antisocial personality disorder, including a complete lack of remorse, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a profound narcissistic worldview that saw other human beings merely as objects to be manipulated or destroyed. Camargo's transition from a troubled youth to an active criminal began in his teenage years. His first recorded arrest came at age 16 for theft, marking the beginning of a criminal career that would span nearly 5 decades. Initially, his crimes were relatively minor: theft, burglary, and fraud, but they demonstrated an escalating pattern of antisocial behavior and a growing comfort with breaking societal rules. During his early 20s, Camargo's criminal activities became more sophisticated and violent. He developed a reputation as a con artist, using his superficial charm and manipulative abilities to defraud vulnerable victims. This period of his life was characterized by frequent relocations as he fled from one jurisdiction to another, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. It was during this time that Camargo first demonstrated his ability to assume false identities and manipulate official documents. He became adept at creating new personas for himself, a skill that would later prove crucial in evading capture during his killing sprees. His criminal network expanded to include document forgers, corrupt officials, and other individuals who could assist in his illegal activities. The first signs of his violent tendencies toward women emerged in the late 1950s. Camargo was arrested several times for assault and battery, typically involving female victims. These incidents, while serious, were largely dismissed by authorities as domestic disputes or isolated incidents of violence. The pattern of escalation that criminal profilers now recognize was not yet apparent to law enforcement of that era. The exact date of Camargo's first murder remains uncertain, but criminal investigators believe his killing career began in the early 1960s. His first confirmed victim was a young woman whom he had lured with promises of employment. The murder displayed several characteristics that would become his signature. The victim was a vulnerable female, often from a lower socioeconomic background, and the killing was both brutal and sexually motivated. What made Camargo particularly dangerous was his methodical approach to murder. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively, Camargo demonstrated careful planning and preparation. He would scout potential victims for days or weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and planning his approach. This calculated methodology allowed him to avoid detection and continue his killing spree for an unprecedented length of time. His early murders were concentrated in Colombia, particularly in rural areas where law enforcement presence was minimal and communication between different police jurisdictions was poor. Camargo exploited these systemic weaknesses, moving frequently between different regions and avoiding areas where his crimes might be connected by investigators. The modus operandi that emerged during this period involved approaching young women, typically between the ages of 12 and 25, with offers of employment, romantic relationships, or other opportunities. He possessed a superficial charm that many victims found appealing, at least initially. Once he had gained their trust and isolated them from potential help, his true nature would emerge. Criminal psychologists who later analyzed his methods noted his sophisticated understanding of victim psychology. He seemed to have an intuitive grasp of which individuals would be most susceptible to his manipulations, often targeting those who were economically desperate, socially isolated, or emotionally vulnerable. This predatory instinct, combined with his complete lack of empathy, made him extraordinarily effective at identifying and exploiting potential victims. By the late 1960s, Camargo's killing spree had intensified dramatically. No longer content with occasional murders, he began killing with increasing frequency and brutality. His victim count climbed steadily as he moved throughout Colombia and eventually began crossing international borders into Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. The geographic spread of his crimes created significant challenges for law enforcement. In an era before sophisticated communication networks and international police cooperation, connecting murders across different countries and jurisdictions was extremely difficult. Camargo exploited these limitations, using false identities and forged documents to move freely between countries, leaving a trail of death in his wake. His killing methods evolved during this period, becoming more ritualistic and psychologically complex. While sexual assault remained a consistent element of his crimes, the murders themselves began to display increasingly sadistic elements. Investigators noted that the level of violence seemed to escalate with each killing, suggesting a psychological need for greater stimulation to achieve the same level of satisfaction. The victims during this period shared several common characteristics. They were almost exclusively young females, often from marginalized communities where their disappearances might not immediately attract police attention. Many were indigenous women, migrants, or individuals involved in sex work, populations that faced significant discrimination and were often overlooked by authorities when they went missing. Camargo's ability to identify and exploit societal prejudices became a crucial element of his success as a predator. He understood that murders of marginalized women would receive less attention from law enforcement and media, allowing him to continue his killing spree with reduced risk of detection. This calculated exploitation of social inequalities demonstrated the sophisticated criminal mind that made him so dangerous. As the 1970s progressed, law enforcement agencies across South America began to recognize patterns in unsolved murders that suggested the work of a serial killer. The breakthrough came when Colombian police connected several murders through similarities in modus operandi and began sharing information with their counterparts in neighboring countries. The investigation that ensued revealed the shocking scope of Camargo's crimes. Bodies were discovered in remote locations across multiple countries, often showing signs of sexual assault and extreme violence. The realization that a single individual might be responsible for dozens of murders sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities and captured international attention. Interpol became involved in the investigation, marking one of the early instances of international cooperation in tracking a serial killer. The case highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies across national borders, lessons that would influence future international police work. Despite the growing attention and resources dedicated to the case, Camargo continued to evade capture. His ability to assume new identities and his intimate knowledge of remote border crossings allowed him to stay ahead of law enforcement. The manhunt became a cat-and-mouse game that would continue for years, with Camargo always seeming to slip away just as authorities closed in. The investigation revealed the inadequacies of criminal justice systems throughout the region. Poor record-keeping, limited communication between agencies, and insufficient resources hampered efforts to track and apprehend the killer. The case became a watershed moment that led to significant reforms in how serial crimes were investigated and prosecuted in South America. In the mid-1970s, Camargo established a more permanent presence in Ecuador, where he would commit some of his most heinous crimes. Using forged documents, he assumed the identity of a traveling salesman, a cover that allowed him to move freely throughout the country while maintaining access to potential victims. His time in Ecuador was marked by an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of his murders. Local authorities later estimated that he killed over 50 women during his time in the country, though the exact number remains disputed. The murders followed his established pattern but showed signs of increasing psychological deterioration and violent fantasy. During this period, Camargo developed what criminologists would later identify as increasingly complex ritualistic behaviors. The crime scenes began to show evidence of post-mortem mutilation and arrangement of bodies in specific positions. These behaviors suggested that his psychological needs were becoming more elaborate and that simple murder was no longer sufficient to satisfy his violent impulses. The Ecuadorian phase of his killing spree also marked the first time that authorities began to develop a comprehensive psychological profile of the killer. Working with international experts, local investigators created detailed analyses of the crime scenes and victim selection patterns. This pioneering work in criminal profiling would later influence similar investigations throughout Latin America. Despite these advances in investigative techniques, Camargo continued to evade capture. His knowledge of local geography, combined with his ability to manipulate and intimidate potential witnesses, allowed him to maintain his killing spree for several more years. The psychological toll on communities throughout Ecuador was enormous, with parents keeping their daughters indoors and entire regions living in fear. The beginning of the end for Daniel Camargo came in the early 1980s when a combination of improved police work and his own increasing carelessness finally provided authorities with the break they needed. A survivor of one of his attacks managed to provide police with a detailed description, and advances in forensic science began to yield physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. The investigation that led to his eventual capture was a masterpiece of international police cooperation. Authorities from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil shared information and resources in an unprecedented effort to apprehend the killer. The use of early computer databases to track patterns across jurisdictions represented a significant advancement in criminal investigation techniques. Camargo's downfall came when he made the fatal error of returning to scenes of previous crimes, a behavior that criminal psychologists identify as common among serial killers who develop emotional attachments to their killing grounds. Surveillance operations at these locations eventually yielded results when he was spotted revisiting an area where he had murdered several victims. The arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Camargo was taken into custody at a bus station in Quito, Ecuador, carrying false identification documents and a bag containing items that would later be linked to several of his victims. His capture marked the end of one of the longest and most intensive manhunts in South American criminal history. The interrogation that followed his arrest revealed the full scope of his crimes for the first time. Over several weeks of questioning, Camargo confessed to more than 150 murders, providing details that only the killer could have known. His confessions painted a horrific picture of decades of violence and revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. The legal proceedings following Camargo's arrest were complex and unprecedented in their scope. With crimes committed across multiple countries, determining jurisdiction and coordinating prosecutions required extensive international legal cooperation. Ecuador ultimately took the lead in prosecuting him, as this was where he had been captured and where many of his most recent crimes had occurred. During his trial, Camargo displayed the same manipulative charm that had enabled him to attract and kill his victims. He seemed to enjoy the attention and notoriety his case had generated, often smiling during testimony about his most brutal crimes. Court observers noted his complete lack of remorse and his apparent pride in his criminal accomplishments. The confession phase of the proceedings provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. Camargo provided detailed accounts of his murders, describing not only the mechanics of how he killed his victims but also his psychological motivations and the satisfaction he derived from their deaths. These confessions became valuable resources for criminal psychologists studying serial killer behavior. His accounts revealed sophisticated planning and preparation that went into each murder. He described how he would scout potential victims, learn their routines, and carefully plan his approach to minimize the risk of detection. The level of calculation involved in his crimes was chilling in its thoroughness and demonstrated his complete objectification of human life. The trial also revealed the broader impact of his crimes on families and communities throughout South America. Testimony from family members of victims provided heartbreaking accounts of lives destroyed and communities terrorized. The full human cost of Camargo's crimes became apparent as dozens of families finally learned the fate of their missing daughters and sisters. The case of Daniel Camargo Barbosa became a landmark study for criminal psychologists and forensic psychiatrists trying to understand the mind of a serial killer. Multiple psychological evaluations conducted during his trial and imprisonment provided unprecedented insight into the thought processes and motivations of one of history's most prolific murderers. Dr. Hernán Villarreal, a prominent Colombian forensic psychiatrist who extensively studied Camargo, identified several key psychological factors that contributed to his violent behavior. The early childhood trauma, combined with apparent genetic predispositions toward antisocial behavior, created what he termed a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction. The psychological profile that emerged painted Camargo as a classic psychopath with narcissistic personality disorder. He demonstrated all the hallmarks of psychopathy: superficial charm, pathological lying, lack of empathy, and an inability to form genuine emotional connections. His narcissistic traits manifested as an inflated sense of self-importance and a belief that he was superior to his victims and even to the authorities pursuing him. Perhaps most chilling was his complete lack of remorse for his actions. Throughout his confessions and psychological evaluations, Camargo never expressed genuine regret for the pain he had caused. Instead, he seemed to view his crimes as accomplishments and took pride in his ability to evade capture for so long. This absence of basic human empathy underscored the profound psychological damage that made him such a dangerous predator. The analysis also revealed the calculated nature of his victim selection. Camargo demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and power structures that allowed him to identify vulnerable individuals who would be unlikely to resist his advances or whose disappearances might not immediately attract attention. This predatory intelligence, combined with his complete lack of moral constraints, made him extraordinarily effective as a killer. The Camargo case had profound implications for criminal justice systems throughout South America and beyond. The investigation and prosecution exposed numerous weaknesses in how serial crimes were handled, leading to significant reforms in police procedures, international cooperation protocols, and victim services. One of the most important changes was the establishment of better communication networks between law enforcement agencies in different countries. The difficulty experienced in tracking Camargo across international borders highlighted the need for improved information sharing and coordination. This case became a catalyst for enhanced cooperation agreements between Latin American countries. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of forensic science and criminal profiling in solving complex cases. The use of early computer databases to track patterns and the development of psychological profiles represented significant advances in investigative techniques. These methods, pioneered during the Camargo investigation, became standard practices in serial crime investigations throughout the region. Victim services also underwent significant improvements as a result of lessons learned from this case. The recognition that marginalized women were particularly vulnerable to predators like Camargo led to the development of specialized programs to protect and support at-risk populations. These initiatives helped address some of the social inequalities that Camargo had exploited. The case also influenced legal reforms related to international extradition and prosecution of crimes that crossed national borders. The complex jurisdictional issues raised by Camargo's multinational killing spree led to new treaties and agreements that simplified the process of pursuing criminals who operate across international boundaries. Following his conviction, Daniel Camargo was sentenced to life imprisonment in Ecuador's maximum security La Penitenciaria del Litoral prison in Guayaquil. His time in prison was marked by continued manipulation and violence, as he struggled to adapt to an environment where his predatory skills were of little use. Prison officials reported that Camargo initially attempted to establish himself as a leader among the inmate population, using the same charm and manipulation tactics that had served him as a killer. However, his reputation preceded him, and many inmates viewed him with disgust and suspicion. Several violent incidents occurred as he clashed with other prisoners who refused to be intimidated by his presence. Despite being behind bars, Camargo continued to seek attention and notoriety. He gave numerous interviews to journalists and researchers, always presenting himself as a celebrity rather than showing any recognition of the harm he had caused. These interviews provided additional insights into his psychological makeup but also demonstrated his continued lack of remorse. His prison years were also marked by several escape attempts, demonstrating that even in captivity, he remained dangerous and calculating. These incidents led to increased security measures and restrictions on his activities within the prison system. The authorities recognized that Camargo would never be safely released and that containing him required constant vigilance. Health problems began to affect him in his later years, though he continued to maintain his manipulative behavior toward medical staff and other prisoners. His physical decline seemed to frustrate him greatly, as it represented a loss of the control and power that had defined his criminal career. Daniel Camargo Barbosa died in prison on November 13, 1994, at the age of 64, bringing an end to one of the most notorious criminal careers in South American history. His death came as a result of complications from various health issues, though some reports suggested he may have been murdered by fellow inmates who were disgusted by his crimes. The news of his death was met with mixed reactions throughout the region. While many felt relief that he could no longer pose a threat, families of his victims expressed frustration that he had died before providing complete information about all of his crimes. Many cases remained unsolved, and his death meant that some families would never know the full truth about their loved ones' fates. His legacy in the field of criminal justice and psychology continues to influence how serial crimes are investigated and understood. The case study materials generated from his crimes and psychological evaluations remain important resources for law enforcement training and academic research. His case is frequently cited in criminal psychology textbooks and continues to be studied by researchers trying to understand the minds of serial killers. The Camargo case also had lasting impacts on popular culture in South America, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and films that explored both his crimes and their impact on society. These cultural works helped keep public attention focused on issues of violence against women and the need for continued improvements in criminal justice systems. Perhaps most importantly, his case highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized women and led to ongoing efforts to address the social inequalities that predators like Camargo exploit. Organizations throughout South America continue to work on programs designed to protect vulnerable populations and ensure that victims of violence receive the attention and justice they deserve. The story of Daniel Camargo Barbosa represents more than just the chronicle of a serial killer's crimes. It serves as a window into the darkest aspects of human nature and the complex social, psychological, and institutional factors that can allow such evil to flourish unchecked for decades. His case demonstrates how childhood trauma, combined with psychological predispositions and social circumstances, can create individuals capable of unimaginable violence. The calculated nature of his crimes and his complete lack of empathy challenge our understanding of human psychology and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the potential for evil that exists within our species. From a criminological perspective, the Camargo case illustrates the importance of early intervention and the need for robust criminal justice systems that can effectively identify, track, and apprehend dangerous criminals. The decades he spent killing with impunity highlight the catastrophic consequences of systemic failures in law enforcement and social services. The case also underscores the particular vulnerability of marginalized populations and the way that social inequalities can be exploited by predators. Camargo's ability to target women who were unlikely to be missed or whose deaths would not be thoroughly investigated reveals uncomfortable truths about how society values different lives. Today, as criminal justice systems continue to evolve and improve, the lessons learned from the Daniel Camargo case remain relevant. His story serves as a reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect society from those who would exploit the vulnerable and destroy innocent lives for their own gratification. The memory of his victims, young women whose lives were cut short by his violence, deserves to be honored through continued efforts to prevent such tragedies. Their deaths were not in vain if they serve to improve our understanding of criminal behavior and our ability to protect future potential victims from similar fates. In the end, Daniel Camargo Barbosa's story is not just about one man's descent into evil, but about society's ongoing struggle to understand, prevent, and respond to the darkest manifestations of human behavior. His case continues to inform criminal justice practices, psychological research, and social policies aimed at creating a safer world for all.